I'm afraid it will take that. Yes, that in other words, as our level of vaccinations diminish, these viruses and other infectious agents that are out there still in the world will be imported back into the United States and will find unvaccinated children and adults. So we'll see more illness, hospitalizations, and even occasional, with great tragedy, deaths.
Well, welcome to another edition of SOS America. I'm Charles Feldman, your host. And for those of you who have been kind enough to be watching or listening to these episodes over the past many months, you know that this is a podcast that we kind of like to call a conversation about America. And we hope to answer some of the questions that people who are outside as well as inside the United States might have about, as I always put it, maybe not in the most delicate of terms, what the hell is going on here? That it does seem to be the question that comes up a lot. And so we try to answer it on each episode, interviewing several political leaders or economic leaders or medical leaders. And that leads us to today's podcast and today's guest. With us, I'm very pleased to say we have Dr. William Schaffner, who is the professor of preventive medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. For those of you who are literate and read, you never can tell nowadays. You have probably seen his name pop up very often in places like the New York Times, where he is often called upon to give his medical expertise. I have talked with him many times over the years on my old radio program here in Los Angeles. I know we went, Bill, through the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, I should say, talking many times about all the issues that came up and still, I guess, are coming up. Dr. Schaffner, thank you so much for being with us.
Charles, it's always good to be with you.
So let me start off by asking a very broad question, and then we can drill down and try to get a little bit more specific if we can. Is it an overstatement on my part, and please don't hesitate to tell me if it is, to say that in the past, and I'll pick an arbitrary starting point, say past 1 year, has there been a real change in what I guess one would call, American medical policy? And I'm not quite sure even what I mean by that, because I don't know if we have an American medical policy, but maybe you know what I mean. Do you?
Well, Charles, I would agree with you. Certainly from the point of view of public health,
Okay.
the kind of preventive aspects of medicine, the population-based community aspects of medicine, there has been an extraordinary shift in federal policy, which has then transferred itself down to state and local levels, for sure. Now, part of this was initiated, and we can reflect back on COVID, about a lot of people's unhappiness about vaccine policy at that time. And there isn't any doubt that there is not the same trust that the population currently that the population currently has, as opposed to what it had years ago regarding public health. But beyond that, the authorities in Washington certainly have changed public health policy such that it has been substantially, I think, adversely impacted over the last year. And fingers crossed, but we anticipate further disruption of that trust and good science-based recommendations that we're used to having come from the government.
All right, so let's see if we can get some specifics here. So when you talk about a change in public policy, health policy, give us some specifics. How has it changed, and how has it changed in your view for the worse?
Well, as you know, I'm very associated with vaccines. So
Yeah.
let's start there with a specific example. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, had an external group of experts that advised the center director on national vaccine policy, who ought to get which vaccines, when, and under what circumstances. This was a committee called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, known as the ACIP. It had been in existence for 60 years and was highly regarded, and other professional societies collaborated with that committee in order to establish public health policy regarding vaccine use in the U.S.
And you were on that committee, were you not?
I was a former member
Former
and then
member.
what's called a consultant to the committee
Okay.
for many, many years. Now, the administration fired everyone in that committee and then replaced those members with a group of people who were largely vaccine skeptics and who had issued in their previous lives strong statements being skeptical about the effectiveness and the safety of vaccines. And they have started to function, not always in a smooth fashion, but they've started to function in such a way that has caused distress in the public health community and among pediatricians, internists, and others who are delivering vaccines to the public. So it's gotten to the point where some of my colleagues have said very explicitly, and I understand this, you can no longer rely on the recommendations from this committee. I mean, that's horrific.
But I can hear, Doctor, some people watching this podcast saying, well, what's so bad about being skeptical about pretty much anything involving medicine, vaccines included? What's wrong with that?
Well, bravo. Let's all be skeptical. In fact, the one of the major characteristics of the members of this committee is that they were intensely skeptical. They questioned the data constantly. But you have to have your skepticism based on rigorous science. And when that happens, then we're in good shape. You know, recommendations always have to be made in the context of wishing for even more information. But you use the information you have blended with expertise and experience to make solid recommendations. When the data are ignored or junk science, I don't even want to call it science, just junk is admitted into the discussions, then the process deteriorates. Then you have recommendations made on the basis of, I would say, a social policy, for example. There have been times when this committee, in its few meetings that it's had so far, seemed to be a little bit like, what was it called? A kangaroo court? In other words, you have your decision made before you see the information, and then you provide so-called information to support your preconceived notions. That's not the way science works. That's the antithesis of science.
Where in your view did this skepticism all come from? I mean, certainly some people have always been skeptical about science, about medicine, but there does seem to be and I hesitate to use the word groundswell because I don't think it is that, but certainly a larger proportion, I think it is fair to say that, of the American population that has expressed skepticism than perhaps in more recent past. Why did that happen? Is it all pegged to the COVID pandemic? Is that the origins of this?
COVID, I think, catalyzed it, it enhanced it, but it had its beginnings long ago. First of all, we all need to recognize that with any vaccine or any medication, there are going to be adverse events. Minor, a medicine upsets your tummy. Not so bad, you can deal with that. But then sometimes adverse events that are more severe, as it is with vaccines. Now, if you have the expectation of perfection, you're going to be disappointed. Now, back in the day, the bad old days, when there was a lot of bad infectious diseases that were going on, every mother either respected or feared those infectious diseases
Hmm.
because of the health of their children, right?
We're talking about things like smallpox and
Smallpox, diphtheria, tetanus, measles, etc. Every mother was aware of them. With the widespread implementation of vaccines, the diseases disappeared. And we had then 1, 2, 3 generations now of mothers who never experienced the diseases. And when that happens, you don't fear the disease anymore because you know nothing about it. And then you don't value the vaccine and you focus on the adverse events associated with the vaccine. And you begin then to ask questions, which is a good thing. But pediatricians and family doctors began to see that they had to fill a very large educational gap, educating families about how severe, for example, measles was, that it was not a trivial infection, and therefore your child needs to get the measles vaccine. Now, in addition to that, what happened during COVID to accelerate this is that vaccines were obligatory in many circumstances. You know, we in healthcare are obliged to get vaccinated against a whole list of illnesses before we can practice in hospitals and clinics. The military has a whole list of vaccines, but the general public was not familiar with that. And because of, I think, not really very good communication during COVID, there were many people who were dubious about COVID and then became really resistant to vaccines being obligatory. And as you know, in order to attend daycare and school in the United States, every state has put forth a list of vaccines for which children must have received the vaccine unless they have a medical contraindication in order to attend school. And so we had a lot of, first of all, a lack of education that led to hesitancy and skepticism. And then there was also always a core group of people who were literally anti-vaccine. And that proportion of the population just grew and grew and grew. And that's what we have today. We're having to deal with that, I'm afraid.
Did some of this also, the skepticism, come about because at the very early stages of COVID, when people were waiting for a vaccine, and you probably, maybe you don't remember, we had talked about this on my old radio program. I was in the the Pfizer COVID vaccine trial. I ended up being in the placebo group, and I remember asking the doctor in charge of my group. I said, "So basically, I was in the group you were hoping would die to prove that the vaccine would work," and he actually didn't dispute what I said. But fortunately, I went on to get it. But what I'm getting at here is I also remember, though, at that time, that public health officials largely, not all, but largely oversold the COVID vaccine. I remember when I finally was told, well, you were in the placebo group, but now you can come in and get the actual shot for ethical reasons. And so I did. And I remember kind of being told, well, now you probably won't get COVID because it'll take a couple of weeks. Your antibodies will build up because of our vaccine, which is proven to work, and done. But of course, as you and I both know, that wasn't actually the case, that the vaccines turned out to be very good and still are at heading off serious illness. But after a few months' time, when you get a shot or a booster, you still can. And I certainly know this for a fact because I ended up getting COVID, I think, 4 times, even though I've had every single booster for COVID that has been available, including the most recent one. So my question is, was overselling its efficacy in the beginning part of what has led to this great skepticism now about all vaccines?
I think that was certainly a contributing factor. The clinical trials, which were done very, very rigorously, were dubbed Operation Warp Speed.
Mhm.
We in the public health community were so excited about how quickly this vaccine was produced and assessed rigorously according to all the standards that we were euphoric that we had an intervention that could diminish the impact of this global pandemic that was occurring. Obviously, we didn't know everything about this vaccine. Also, that that little slogan, Operation Warp Speed, was interpreted different ways than we
Mm.
interpreted it. We were excited about that, but many in the public were skeptical. And they raised the question, were you cutting corners to
Mm.
do that? Of course we weren't, but that was not effectively communicated. And as you point out, the initial trials, which ran for several months, showed the extraordinary effectiveness of the vaccine. But as time passed, it became apparent that that protection, good as it was initially, diminished over time much more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. So by the time you get out to 6, 7, 8 months after vaccination, you may not be back to your baseline, but your level of protection has substantially diminished. And of course, that led to the notion that we have to keep revaccinating periodically in order to keep our immune system up to par, able to fight off this virus. All of that was unknown. And I think we didn't communicate all of those uncertainties to the population very clearly.
Yeah, I remember, in fact, in addition to my regular radio show, I was doing a podcast every day that we called Coronavirus Daily because there was so much information that was out there. And I remember maybe it was, I want to say 2, 3 months after the vaccines became available. I remember what a big news story it was because all of a sudden, the story started emerging that there were one, then two, then three, then five people who said, well, we got vaccinated and now we have COVID. And it was a huge story a few years ago because everybody thought that these people should have been eternally protected from COVID infection, and of course they ended up not being, although their illnesses were, I believe, every single one of those initial people very, very mild, as has been the times I've had COVID.
Yeah, well, that's the point. One of the things that we've learned about the vaccine, which sounds paradoxical, it's hard for the average person to understand that these vaccines actually work better at preventing severe disease than mild disease. That doesn't make any common sense, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's hard to understand. Actually, it's the same for flu vaccine and RSV vaccine. These respiratory virus vaccines work to keep us out of the hospital, but we can still have mild disease. Mild disease can make you feel miserable for several days, but you don't need hospitalization. And that's kind of a hard notion
Yeah.
in and of itself for people to understand.
The you said something earlier when you were talking about the skepticism and how parents, for example, years ago learned to fear certain diseases, and so were very welcoming when vaccines that were proven to be effective came around, and were very quick to want to have their kids vaccinated. I know I grew up in New York City in the late 50s, but mostly the 60s, and certainly my mother in particular was very anxious for me to be vaccinated with anything that was available,
Yes.
so that I wouldn't get ill. But that means the other side of that coin, and correct me if I'm wrong, does this mean that in order to get the general population to come back to that level of confidence in effective vaccination, notwithstanding current administration and Washington policies, that parents are going to, unfortunately, have to come face to face with the brutal reality of how dangerous some of these diseases can be if their child is not vaccinated? Is that what it's going to take?
I'm afraid it will take that. Yes. That, in other words, as our level of vaccinations diminish, these viruses and other infectious agents that are out there still in the world will be imported back into the United States and will find unvaccinated children and adults. We're seeing this happen with measles now. It's the most contagious, and that was the one we expected to happen first. So we'll see more illness, hospitalizations, and even occasional, with great tragedy, deaths due to these previously forgotten and thought to be mild diseases. So I think that will happen. Charles, let me get on to a little hobby horse related to this.
Sure. Yeah.
I think in general, most of us have thought about this problem as a public health and medical problem, which it certainly is. I'm going to suggest it's also an educational problem. Namely, if you and I were to look at the health curriculum in middle school and high school, first of all, they say very little about vaccines. And they certainly say almost nothing about those bad old diseases. Of course not. The teachers and the people who created those curricula thought, as we did, that was all in the past. We have other things to think about now. But think about it. If you and I went to a high school graduation, we can pick any high school we want, and pull some students out and ask them two simple questions. What is a vaccine? How does a vaccine work? I think we wouldn't get sharp answers. I think we would. I think we'd get a lot of confusion. And if we're graduating students who can't answer those simple questions, a vaccine's something you take in order to prevent a disease. Number two, how does a vaccine work? It stimulates your immune system so it can fight off the germs. Very simple concepts. If they don't know that, those are the parents of tomorrow. And no wonder they have questions. So we need to look at this as not only a medical and public health issue, but an educational issue. We have to reinvigorate the health curriculum that exists in middle school and high school about these diseases and about vaccines, what they are, how they work, and that the more vaccines we have, the more disease that's prevented. And
Well, I
of
agree
course,
with you.
prevention of disease is the highest goal of medicine.
I agree with you that it's a public health and educational issue, but as we've kind of suggested thus far, it is also very much a political issue, especially in this country.
Oh,
Um,
it is.
yeah, and so to what degree do you hold current political policy in Washington culpable?
Well, as you know, I talk about policies rather than the
Yes,
origins of the policies, and I certainly don't talk about individuals.
right.
But it is really quite clear that what we've heard for the past year has not been a ringing endorsement of vaccines. It's an interesting social and a valid social debate because the way it's posed is individual parental choice
Hmm.
versus compulsion. Now, isn't that interesting? You know, if we have individual patient and parent choice and remove all obligations, there is no doubt that these diseases will come back. We've done this experiment before in the United States. We've seen what happens when things were purely on a voluntary basis and we did not have, for example, school immunization requirements. As I like to say, when you're in a war, and if we can conceive of ourselves, it's a bad metaphor, but in a war against infectious diseases, sometimes you have to have a draft and everybody has to
Right.
submit to the draft. Boys and girls, we all have to be drafted to fight the enemy. And of course, that's the reason for being obliged to be vaccinated before you do A, B, or C. Go to school, be a healthcare worker, be in the armed forces, and the like.
So I'm a viewer or listener, say, in the UK or in France or you pick your country, and happen to be watching this particular podcast. Why should I care about all the things that we've just now discussed happening here in the US? Why should I give a damn? Should I?
Well, well, actually, I think viewers elsewhere should consider this also. Uh, do you tolerate the occurrence of certain diseases and their consequences, hospitalization, intensive care unit admissions, and deaths, because you do not compel everyone to be vaccinated? And that is a valid social debate. It wasn't so many years ago that we had over 20,000 cases of measles in France. I'm not happy about that in the United States because the more measles there is in France, the more importations will come to the United States. Thank you very much. I'd like you to quash your measles just
Yeah.
as we're trying to do ours, because what we're doing here helps you. What you're doing there helps us. We're all in this together. We're only a plane ride away from each other.
What other than vaccines has changed in US health policy in the past year?
There has been a denigration of research. Many research grants working on things as important as Alzheimer's disease, for example, have simply been ended, stopped. And the United States, we think, has been the leader in many areas of biomedical research. the studies you do today will benefit your children and grandchildren tomorrow. That's the way it's been. If you stop that research, you also will not generate the next group of investigators, right? And so
Mhm.
we will have these enormous gaps in scientific basis for advancing the general health of the global community. And so that's been a very serious matter. And in addition, as you know, our humanitarian outreach to other countries as regards health has been discontinued in many areas. Just from our own point of view, I think that's very bad policy. What's the best way to make friends? I've always said what's called white coat diplomacy,
Mm.
sending physicians and scientists and public health people to other countries that are just developing their own systems to help them establish their own so that they can help their own populations. That's friendship. Making those friends seems to be what is the basis of diplomacy. You want more friends than you want enemies out there. So that's the way to do that. And of course, the other reason to do that is if you can prevent disease over there, it won't come over here. So
But that research,
it's humanitarian for those people, but it's in our own best interests.
sure. But all that research, doctor, that you mentioned has now ground to a halt here. Uh, the questions that those researchers were trying to get answers to clearly are questions that are applicable all over the world to other researchers. So does this mean that there's going to be a dramatic shift on where the research of the future for medical purposes is likely to take place? For example, will China end up emerging perhaps as in the next decade or two, if we continue here in the US with the current policies that we have? Will they emerge perhaps as a leader in biomedical research because we're not doing it here anymore?
Oh, I think there isn't any doubt, Charles, that other countries will fill the gap, at least in part. China's a scientific powerhouse, and that's true in many areas, but also biomedical research. The European countries have strong research enterprises, and they will have a harder time expanding those, but I would hope that they remain intact. You know, it's interesting how many Europeans and people in other countries had grants from the National Institutes of Health. Those grants for scientific research didn't end at our borders, but extended around the world. Another way to make friends and have scientists collaborate and communicate with each other. All of those mechanisms have been challenged now or broken. It will take a long time to restore those.
Here's what I guess I don't totally understand, and maybe you do, and if so, help me out with this. At one level, I do understand those people who are very skeptical, for example, about vaccines. I get it. I don't agree with them, but I do understand it. What I have a bigger problem understanding is what's the beef with doing basic research? It would seem contradictory if, on the one hand, the same person, the person who is skeptical about vaccines, because they say, well, it hasn't been, for the example, the COVID vaccine, oh, it wasn't studied enough, or whatever else they come up with as a reason to not want to get a shot or a booster. You would think that that person would be a huge advocate for doing more research, because that is what's at the core of their skepticism about whether it's the COVID vaccine or measles vaccine, you name it, is they claim it's not researched enough, right? So what I don't really get is why does the skepticism about vaccines seem to spill over into a skepticism, a reluctance even, to do medical research? I don't get that. Do you?
You're asking the wrong person because I don't either. And if we take it away from vaccines, why would one want to eliminate an Alzheimer's research program, right?
Yeah.
Loss of our mind is certainly one of the things that, as we get older, we all fear. And doing more research in order to prevent and treat Alzheimer's would seem very straightforward. And we could make a whole list of diseases, staying away from vaccines. And as you say, Charles, basic research, that is the fundamental on which further innovations are built. So you've got to let people do that basic research that doesn't always have an immediate practical outcome, but has us understand the biology of, say, Alzheimer's disease better. Then down the road, another group of scientists can take that information and create something, a useful medication, for example. So if you stop the basic research, we'll never get to the science that can create the medicine. And so stopping all that is beyond my understanding. Now, you'll have to ask folks who have this kind of skepticism why they don't tie those things together. Why aren't they upset about, I keep using Alzheimer's as an obvious example, about inhibiting Alzheimer's research and stopping it. Why is that a good thing? Why do they tolerate that? Why aren't they speaking up against that?
Well, do you have any theories? I'm open to hearing them.
Well, some of them has just to do with a lack of research of anyone in authority. Those bozos up there got it wrong. I'm unhappy with them. We'll just throw the whole kit and caboodle out. And we'll start over maybe. Something like that. It's the sort of thing you might hear in a bar.
Yeah. That's kind of frightening, though.
Well, Jane and John Q. Public are out there, and that means in part that Dr. Bill certainly hasn't reached them. Right? We're not on the same wavelength. And that distresses me that I've been unable to hear them as clearly as I would like. And certainly that they've been indifferent to my concerns.
You interact, I presume, right, with young doctors who are sort of getting into the system right now. If we have a system, I'm not quite sure we have a medical system in this country, but you know what I mean. What kind of advice do you give them on how to deal with their future patients who, when that doctor says to them, your child should be vaccinated for whatever, or you yourself should be, taking the flu shot, and the patient says, "Oh, doctor, I don't believe in those things. I don't think they really work." Do you give them advice about how they deal with that? Because they are going to have to deal with that.
So Charles, first, let me reassure you, the young people we see coming into medical school year after year are wonderful. They're bright, they're idealistic, they want to do good things, they want to lay on hands and cure, they want to comfort. So they are wonderful. Now, those who want to continue clinically are more assured of positions. There'll always be illness, and doctors needed to care for those who are ill. It's those who had an interest in going into public health that are now finding the future very murky. They're uncertain. But as regards those who will be dealing with patients directly, every medical school is doing much more in helping these young people learn to listen before they talk, and then to interact, to communicate with their patients, not just to them, but with them in such a way that they respect the patient's questions and answer them in an appropriate way. So we hope the patients feel comfortable and reassured. Let me make a distinction. Giving patients a lot of facts is probably fundamental. That goes to their brain. But the behavioral psychologists have told us that's rarely sufficient to change behavior. What you have to do is influence how patients feel, what's in their heart or their guts. You have to make them feel comfortable and reassured and give them a sense that they're doing something that their peers, their friends are also doing, that they're not going to be social outliers. This is much more challenging than giving them a lecture in medical school where we give them a lot of facts about vaccines. So this is much more challenging. And we're trying to help young medical students learn that they have to reassure patients, make them feel comfortable, as well as giving them specific information.
But what do you do with the up and coming physician who is really bright, would make a great doctor medically, wants to treat patients, but not everybody has the knack for having, they used to call it bedside manner, right? I don't know if they call it that anymore, but not everybody is good at sitting in a room with a patient, or perhaps a patient and his or her family, and talking on a very heartfelt level. It's a skill that perhaps can be sharpened. I would argue it's a skill that a lot of people are just not born with and cannot be acquired in any school.
Well, first of all, people kind of separate themselves out as to what they want to do. Just as a medical student, you say, "Oh, I'm going to be a pediatrician," as opposed to being a neurosurgeon, right?
Yeah.
So things begin to sort themselves out. Depends on how you feel and how successful you are in the various environments. And then the other thing I'll go back to is what I've just said, namely, back in the day when I went to medical school, this kind of listening and interaction with patients wasn't taught. It was thought we all knew how to do that because we wanted to become doctors. Clearly, that was not correct. Today, medical schools are spending time and have actual curricula in helping students learn how to do that, to have the patience, to have, as my mother used to say, your ears open and your mouth shut.
Let me get back, as we close this particular episode, to the destruction, and I think that that's a good word and an apt word of the current public health policy in this country, and a deliberate destruction at that. How long do you think it is going to take to rebuild it? I mean, it's not something that's going to be changed, even if another administration, not if, when another administration comes in, and perhaps they're not of the same inclination as the current administration. It still is going to take a long time, isn't it? I mean, the destruction is of catastrophic levels in many ways, or am I exaggerating?
No, you're not exaggerating at all, Charles. This is not like instant tea. We don't have a tea bag here that can suddenly create the next generation of public health authorities, right? Or recreate that trust. We're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. We're going to have to earn it. And I think this is serious damage, and it will take many years, easily a decade, could be more, depending on the circumstances. We've hollowed out the CDC. Many of its top and middle level people who had experience and knowledge have either been fired or have taken early retirement. To have the young people develop that experience and come up and have that kind of wisdom so that they can make wise decisions on behalf of all of us here in the United States and indeed around the world will take time. And to restore the trust in the public, that will have to be earned very hard. And we're going to have to be very much improved in our clear communication with the public.
And as all of these years and maybe even decades go by, what happens to all of us in the interim?
Well, I think I am concerned that we will suffer the return, speaking again of vaccines, of some of these illnesses, these infections that were thought to be only in the history books, but we'll see them again in the United States. And since similar things are happening around the world also. And our progress in dealing with all the varieties of heart disease, lung disease, liver disease, kidney disease, Alzheimer's disease, all of that progress will have been unfortunately slowed.
Dr. William Schaffner at Vanderbilt University, medical center professor there, a world-renowned and world-class, I would say as well, a physician, researcher in his own right, and authority on many medical subjects. It is always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for taking your time to be with us on SOS America. For those of you who are watching or listening, as I always say, we welcome your comments. And by all means, if you would like to subscribe to this or future episodes, it is absolutely free, so we encourage you to do so. Until the next episode of SOS America, I'm Charles Feldman. Thank you so much.